Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac event. My name is Sabra Lane, I am the club's president. I'm also the presenter of the ABC radio program AM. Today's guest is Jane Halton. Jane is she's well known here in Canberra. She's enjoyed a 33-year career in the public service, including stints as the Secretary of the Department of Health and the Department of Finance. Right now though, arguably, probably her most important job ever. It's the chair of the CEPI board. CEPI stands for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, and it is coordinating the search around the world for a vaccine for COVID-19. Our format today is in conversational style, and then I'll take some questions from the floor from my colleagues here. The event is being held under COVID restrictions today. So if you want to follow the conversation, you'll find us online on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAUST. Jane Halton, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's go very first to what is CEPI? What does it stand for? Who does it involve?
So CEPI, which as an article I read yesterday said the hitherto little known CEPI, is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which I know is a horrible mouthful, which is why we all say CEPI. And it was an initiative basically driven by a couple of really forward-leaning population health experts from around the world who were really worried that when we dealt with Ebola in West Africa, we as a globe didn't do it very well. We weren't ready, we didn't have a vaccine, and they said to themselves, there's a whole list of what the WHO calls priority pathogens, things we should worry about. Interestingly, coronavirus is one of them, and we need to do something to be more ready. So working with the World Economic Forum, and I got dragged in quite early in this discussion by my friends in Norway, love them. And what we did was create this new not-for-profit globally, and its job has been to prepare. We thought for epidemics. We didn't think one of these would instantly turn into a pandemic, but at least we had 2 years' worth of head start on that work.
2 years of head start. Now this search is underway. You've joined forces with a group called Gavi.
Yes.
The genetic sequence for this particular coronavirus was revealed in January, and since then there's been this global rush of organisations to scramble now to find a vaccine, to accelerate its development. CEPI has got behind 10 particular vaccines.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
So, as you say, the Chinese government released the genetic sequence on the 9th of January, and I should acknowledge that that is very early in this process, and that's been unbelievably important in enabling groups around the world, and we think we saw our own fabulous scientists in Melbourne being the first to replicate actually in the world, which was great. So basically what we have been doing since that time is working on exactly how we can accelerate what normally takes years and years and years to do, which is to develop a vaccine. Remember that things like measles took 4 years. That was short. We don't have a vaccine for HIV. So basically what we're trying to do is in record time, and at the risk of using what the comedians are now saying is the word of the pandemic, unprecedented, at unprecedented speed to create a vaccine.
It's unprecedented work. People are also sort of giving the impression that 18 months, 2 years will have it, but that's being very overly optimistic.
Well, I mean, so let's do some numbers. Most vaccine candidates fail at phase 1 and phase 2. Right? And if you want to use the precise number that's in the literature, it will tell you 94% of candidates fail. Now, the good news is there are about 130 groups working on a vaccine around the world. So if you want to do the numbers on this, we've got a reasonable chance of getting at least one out of it. But I actually think there's probably a bit more that we can be positive about here. So because, and people would have heard of the SARS epidemic, and they may have heard of something called MERS. They're all coronaviruses. And there's a number of people who've been working on those particular viruses before we got to this point. So we've already got quite a bit of work that's been done. So we're hopeful that combined with the fact that the technologies that we're using now, so if I exclude the other category, there are 7 different categories of technologies that are being used to create, we hope, a successful vaccine. So I'm in the let's have a glass of water, half full, not half empty category. So I'm hopeful that we will get a vaccine, but you're right. We actually need to think about how we're going to manage our lives in case there isn't, and certainly in the interim.
There is one of those 10 successful candidates that you're looking at is Australian-based.
That's right.
I think they're already talking about potentially human trials in July.
That's right.
Which is, a lot of people have their fingers and toes crossed for that.
Absolutely.
You included?
Absolutely. My knees are crossed, everything's crossed. That's right.
Is there enough money? Initially, I think that the target was set $2 billion to try and get this underway. Are countries tipping in enough money at this stage to do that?
Well, I think what we've seen in the last few weeks is an acknowledgement by many, many countries that actually this is an expensive business. So, and it's worth putting in context. When CEPI was created, we had an objective of raising $1 billion in the first 5 years, and we raised 850 million in the first 18 months, which we thought was pretty good. When we put out our call for $2 billion for the development work that we thought was necessary, and I should emphasise, this is not for production. It doesn't get you a single licensed dose of vaccine. It's just the work that we need to do to even get to that start line. We put out a call for $2 billion. So far, we've raised about $1.4 billion. But in addition to that, sovereign nations, countries around the world are investing huge additional amounts of money. So not only have we had people give us money to invest in what the scientific community says are the best possible candidates, but they're also putting money into their backyards, and that's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So we can always use more, but I would have to acknowledge that the world has stood up in terms of actually providing funding. And when it gets to the point where more money is needed for things like trials or production, etc., I'd be pretty confident. There's nothing like self-interest, Sabra.
Exactly. Bill Gates, I think, said that getting a vaccine would be half the battle. The other big problem would be mass production.
Absolutely.
How on earth will that, what talks are happening now to ensure that mass production can happen around the globe? But not only that, and the World Health Organization meeting and assembly tonight is going to dig into this as well, but how do you make sure that it's equitable, that poor countries as well as wealthy countries get a fair crack at this?
So this is a whole long and difficult conversation. So let's start with the production discussion. Now, we all assume that vaccines are there when we need them. We know sometimes there are delays in getting flu vaccine, for example, and we wait until our surgery or our pharmacy or whatever has that available for us. But we don't usually face a situation where a wanted vaccine is something that we just can't get our hands on. And in this case, the whole world will want a vaccine. About 8 billion people in the world, so that's about 8 billion people who I think will want this vaccine. And we know that there are particular groups in the population who will be vulnerable until they get a vaccine. Everyone's slightly vulnerable, but we know that for older people, the people who are immune compromised, people who have significant comorbidities, they're the people who will desperately need this vaccine as soon as it's available. So first we have to say, can we make enough of this? And even if you said that you need 2 billion doses almost as soon as you can get them, then you need the rest, the additional 6 billion that you need. And remember that it may not just be a 1-dose vaccine. We don't know that. It may be a 2-dose vaccine. So just do the math and you can see that this is a lot of vaccine to produce. So then what we do is we look around the world. And the large majority of companies, biotechs, etc., who are working on this are small. And even though some of them have ambition that they could produce large volumes of vaccine, the people that I'm very privileged to work with at CEPI and the broader community that I work with on this will tell you that making a vaccine is a really hard thing to do. And so you need a lot of experience, you need people who are technically capable, and you need scale of infrastructure. So what we're doing is working with what the the acronym, Canberra, we love an acronym, the MNCs, so the multinational companies, talking about how we would scale production really, really quickly. And it depends on whether you think this will be a hard-to-produce vaccine or an easy-to-produce vaccine. And I mentioned the technologies that are being used. Some of these are hard to produce, so they'll be slow. So everyone keep their fingers and toes crossed for success, multiple vaccines, and a vaccine that is easy to produce. Now, we're lucky. There are a couple of new global facilities that are coming online, one of which I'm aware of has the capacity to produce 3 billion doses in a year. But we also need to remember that we can't stop producing measles, mumps, rubella, etc., the other things that damage kids and hurt people. So we've got to find a way to produce large amounts of vaccine with people who know how to do this, and then we need to make sure that people get access to it.
What about looking at it here in Australia? Australia's capacity to do that? CSL, maybe? Are there other companies? Have we got capacity to be able to pump out 25 million plus vials here?
Yeah, so CSL, of course, is significant on the global stage. They have huge capacity. They've got great science and great people, and they are just fantastic, particularly in flu, but they do other things as well. So CSL, obviously, in terms of the work that we at CEPI are doing, are featuring in our discussions, and it's not break any confidences to say I indeed have talked to CSL about our ambitions to work with them as well. So, but we do need to remember, you talk about 25 million doses. I think we need to understand as Australia that it would not be the right thing if we produced 25 billion doses for us first and then said to the rest of the world, okay, now we're good. Because let's be honest, if we don't have success in Australia, someone else might, and we don't want them to treat us like that either. So we do have to think about not only the amount of production, where it is, and then how we're going to get access to that vaccine.
Our South Pacific neighbours, perhaps, keeping them well
Absolutely.
in mind. You also talked about those, the elderly, being at the front of the queue. What about health workers to
Absolutely.
ensure?
Well, I should have said, actually, in fact, normally when I describe this, I start with our first responders as being the priority. All you have to do is see the images of the amazing work done by health workers in New York and Italy and other places, and the stress, the commitment that they bring, and the stress that they face. And we know that health workers are dying around the world. And so we need to make sure that we protect them. We need to make sure that they can continue to deliver the care to those people who actually do become really unwell. It's a huge priority, absolutely.
Do you worry about that, the corporate dollars at the end of the day being able to speak volumes when other people can't? And for example, Sanofi in France said that it was working on a vaccine, and its chief executive said late last week that the US government would have first rights. He then later backtracked on that when the French government complained about that.
Yes.
Are multinationals being reminded of their obligations here, that it's not just about bucks?
So one of the things I have been sounding a warning bell about is vaccine nationalism. And we do need to understand that, and there's a backstory to this about 2009, which I might come to, but we do need to understand that if this virus is anywhere in the world and vulnerable people have not been protected, everyone is still vulnerable. And we need to remember that the things that we hold dear, which is, being able to go to the beach and, go to the pub with our mates and not have to basically stand at a socially distanced, appropriate remove, but importantly, so we can go back to work, so we can manage our economy, so we can export, so tourists can come, so we can go visit our friends and families overseas. So if we have vaccine nationalism and one country looks after itself first and at the expense of the rest of the world, everyone is going to continue to suffer. Now, this is difficult because you've alluded to the fact that the dollar talks. And one of the things that was announced a couple of weeks ago in Europe was this new collaboration where what the WHO will do is work out who these priority recipients should be, but then we're looking to create a mechanism so that actually those priority recipients get that vaccine first. Now, this is hard because it's going to require people to cooperate, and the urge for domestic priority, I think, will be very significant. And so for countries, I think they have to think really carefully about what obligation they have to their citizens, particularly their vulnerable citizens, and that I understand, completely understand. But once you've gotten through your vulnerable citizens, I mean, in any event, what are you doing if there is a vaccine produced in your country or by your company? What share of that is going to vulnerable people around the world at the same time? I mean, this is, at the moment, we're all in it together. As soon as there is a vaccine, I fear that we will maybe not be quite all in it as together as we have been.
How important will the World Health Organisation be in making sure there is cooperation right around the world? Do you have... You can give us terrific insight because you used to head WHO for a short time. You're involved in the Assembly for 3 years, if I remember right.
Yes, Margaret Chan, the former Director General, said I had every non-elected office there was. I was President of the Assembly, I chaired the board, I could go on. Yes, I do have some familiarity with the workings of the WHO.
Herding cats easier?
Fair question. You can't take cats into the building, so there's not a relevant comparison. So, but I think it does have some of the same attributes.
How difficult... Let's look at that prospect itself of trying to get cooperation. Would you... this is something that we shouldn't hold our breaths and expect an answer on this week or even next week or next month. It's going to take time.
So I think we need to understand, I mean, the WHO has a series of very particular jobs to do. They're a normative agency. In other words, they set standards. They will have a crucial role to play in being very clear about who should get this vaccine first. And they're working with us in the accelerator, looking at how we develop products. But the WHO doesn't actually develop things. So they don't make vaccines, they don't do that science. And that science has to be done both out in those multinational companies, in those small biotechs that I talked about, and in academic institutions. So our job, I think, is to, and this is what we're doing, both at CEPI but also with Gavi, who you've mentioned, we're trying to bring together a coalition, which is why we are a coalition. And in our case, we're a coalition of the private sector, the academic world, and the public sector in its broadest meaning. But our job is to make sure that we all work together seamlessly, because for the WHO, they are a creature of their member states. They do what their member states ask, but we, outside that structure, but working literally with them hip to hip, except you aren't allowed to do that, of course, at the moment. Socially distanced, but quite close. We are making sure that we bring together the capacity of people who make vaccines, the scientists who are developing those vaccines, and then the allocation mechanisms. And then, of course, we have to make sure we can finance that as well. And that's where I talked earlier about the $2 billion for the beginning of this. Let's be clear, to buy this stuff, to get it distributed, we are talking tens of billions of dollars.
The World Health Assembly also tonight will consider a proposition that's been jointly put forward by Australia and the European Union to look at, go back to basics. How did this pandemic occur? Yes. China has taken sharp offence at all of that. It looks like there'll be, I think, latest estimates, 120 nations plus to support this. How significant is that so far that so many countries are supporting this? So, zoonosis, which is the process where a virus will transmit from an animal or a bird to a human, is something that we've seen over history, but we've seen a lot of it quite recently. And it's not just the WHO and its resolutions that are important here. The international organisation that worries about animal health, the Food and Agriculture Organisation, are all important parts of this. And in fact, the draft resolution that will be considered by the WHO this evening explicitly talks about the importance of engaging all of the people who are relevant in looking to see how this zoonotic event occurred. Now, I mean, I can understand the concerns of our friends in China about this, but I would say that we need to take a broader perspective on understanding
how this zoonotic event occurred, because what we're looking to do around the world is try and prevent these things happening in the future. And in understanding the science, in understanding the pathway for this virus to basically go to its first human host and then from thence, literally, as we know, around the world, we do need to understand what happened there. And I do think it's important to understand that these events can occur all around the world. So enabling the scientists and those whose job it is to understand and then give us all, I think, really helpful information about how we prevent it in future, that's a global issue that we should all be concerned about. And I think that's what this will do.
Was WHO a little too slow off the mark in declaring this a pandemic? Like Australia got in ahead of WHO, I think it was a fortnight before,
Yes.
and said, it's got potential, we're going to prepare for this. And the government copped some criticism at the time. What does WHO need to do once we're through this? Does it need to have a good look at how it handles pandemics?
Well, I mean, every time you have one of these events, you learn something. So when we had H1N1, which most people would recall as being swine flu, there were circumstances around that as a pandemic which led to changes in procedures of the WHO. I mean, in particular in that particular case, it was not as severe as I think people had naturally assumed a pandemic would be. So what happened was the grading of these events was changed and there was a review. And in fact, I talked earlier about the resolution that will go to the Assembly later on today, our time. And it acknowledges that there are a range of review mechanisms that exist to look at WHO procedures and look at their responses. And I mean, I've known and worked with those people for a very long time, and I know that they will be at the front of the queue to understand what they did well, what they did not do well, and they will be very open to having that conversation. Look, the thing that I think I should emphasise about this issue, and one of the things I've really appreciated with watching some of our political leaders at the moment is, and I think it's something that we've lacked for a while, people saying quite openly, we are going to make some mistakes. And we all make mistakes, but what we need to do is we need to basically move on, we need to manage those really quickly. And like everyone else, the WHO has made a few mistakes, I suspect. What we all want is for them to learn. And look, the good news is, you talked about us getting there quite early. I felt good about that, I will tell you, as a former Australian health official and someone who takes a great interest, because it enabled us to prepare. And I think, to be fair to the WHO, Tedros, who is the Director General, and I should just say we won't give him his full name. He, like Madonna, only needs one name. That is how he's referred to in global health circles, Tedros, period, end of story. So, I mean, Tedros was, I think, putting out messages really early that this was serious and people needed to take time to pay attention, to prepare, etc. So whether or not they labelled it of public concern, global concern or a pandemic early, to my mind, yes, we need to know whether they did that fast enough, but there were warnings being issued. Sometimes I don't think everyone heard those warnings.
Yeah. We'll come to questions in a moment. Bill and Melinda Gates were central in getting CEPI underway.
Absolutely.
And they're still very, very much involved in trying to raise more money as well as give their own.
Yes.
They've also become the focus of weird conspiracy theories online. Why is it, do you think, that people jump to these weird conclusions?
Oh dear, I don't know. Look, I don't know. Have they got too much time on their hands? They're looking to make connections that aren't really there, or they want to think that everyone's basically got bad intent. I don't know the answer to that question, Sabra. I do think, actually, where those conspiracy theories affect people's choices, and we see this with vaccines, let's be honest. We see a lot of people who have conspiracy theories about vaccines, which actually lead people to make, in my view, bad choices. They don't get their children immunised. They've never seen the impact of something like pertussis on a child, the brain damage, the death that can occur, similarly with measles. So I don't know the answer to that. The good news is someone sent me one of those conspiracy theories. It was actually a talk being given by a church leader, and it was all about a conspiracy which involved Bill and Melinda Gates, CEPI, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, all of which I'm connected to. So apparently I am at the centre of this conspiracy, Sabra, and I'm very proud to be at the centre of a conspiracy which tries to provide a vaccine that will actually protect the people of the world. And if that's what I'm doing, I'm happy to stand up for it.
How will you deal with that? If there is a successful vaccine, there will be a cohort of people who will say, I do not want that.
Yes, there will. Look, one of the reasons we talk about the need for herd immunity is that in addition to people say they don't want it, and let's come back to them, but there are some people who have medical conditions that make it difficult for them to be vaccinated. We understand that, and that's one of the reasons why everyone else should do their bit. And the good thing is, now we don't yet know what level of herd immunity we need to give ourselves protection, but let's say it's somewhere between 50 and 80%. And it's worth reminding ourselves that nowhere around the world yet has that herd immunity. So 50 to 80%, let's say it's 80%. So those people who refuse to be vaccinated, we know that governments can take action in relation to childcare and other sorts of things like that. I would encourage government to continue to take those sorts of decisions. And can I just say here and now, the term that I really object to in this space is people who say that they conscientiously object to vaccination. Actually, unless you've got a good health reason, you're a vaccine refuser.
Fair enough. Just before we take our first question, how do you ensure, with all the various research that's happening for vaccines, that there isn't overlap, that groups are simply repeating what others are doing, that there's enough? I mean, you need a little bit of overlap, but that the net is broad.
Well, I think we've already seen that. I've already mentioned that there's 7 major categories of types of vaccine that people are working on. There's another category which has got, when I last looked at it, something like 20 candidates in it, which is just other. So I think the fact that we've got a whole series of different varieties, I mean, what we want, to use a sporting analogy, is we want as many shots on goal as we can get. And one of the things I think it's important to understand is one of the reasons vaccines usually take so long is you do everything in order. So you don't go to the next step until you know that your investment has generated something that's worthwhile. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to run everything in parallel that we can safely. And by doing that, we compress the time. And so, yes, will there be some redundancy in what we're spending on these early stages? There sure will. I don't care about that at all. I want the maximum shots on goal. But what I also want is when we start to narrow down the candidates to things that actually look likely, then what I want is for those to get the full backing that they need in order that we actually, because I said earlier how complex it is to produce a vaccine, and so what we need is to make sure that we back in all of those likely candidates to the maximum extent possible. If we had 3 or 4 viable vaccines which we can produce all around the world, the risk of vaccine nationalism diminishes, the speed to access that vaccine increases. It's all good.
Rosie Lewis.
Hey Jane, nice to see you. I actually wanted to ask you a question in your capacity on the National COVID Coordination Commission, which obviously looks at how to mitigate the impact of coronavirus on jobs and businesses. How critical to that do you think reopening all borders in Australia is? How much better will it be for the economy if all our borders reopen, or could the economy still reboot in some way if we had states operating in silos?
Well, to start with, I can't speak for the Commission because obviously that's not my job. My job is to provide advice to business and to government. And this is obviously a difficult issue at the moment, and people are taking a fairly conservative approach to issues around borders. One of the things I think we do need to understand is that our economy doesn't work in hermetically sealed spheres. And within the bounds of what is sensible from a medical and other perspective, enabling businesses to move products around, enabling workers to the extent that they can safely to return to work, including if that means travelling across borders, I think is a sensible thing to do. Now, I understand people are very nervous about the speed at which we open up, and I do think we all have to remind ourselves, and I think we've all seen behaviour like this over the last few days. I think a lot of people go, it's all good now. And we've seen an absence of social distancing out in public, and I would remind people it's not all good now. And you've still got a grandma, or you've got a friend who is immune compromised, who if you manage to pick up that virus and give it to somebody else, that could have a really bad outcome. So I'm personally not convinced that our internal borders are the right way to manage our risks. I understand why people are nervous, but I would encourage people to think about how we maintain control, perhaps while enabling business to operate.
How worried are you by that Australia's success to date will see complacency in regards to social distancing, hygiene? How much of a concern is that?
I'm very worried about that. I do think that all the messages our leaders have given us, and they're out there saying it every single day, but a bit like when this was going on somewhere else other than here, we didn't completely take it seriously, I think. As soon as it gets close to home, you begin to worry and you take it seriously. I do think the risk for us now is complacency, and I think the simple things that we can do, the hand hygiene, the just standing a little bit distant, and just being respectful of each other, I think will just give us that edge as we try and recover our economy. But I'm worried about it, and what we'll see is little spikes, and I hope that will remind people that this isn't just a question of me going, oh, there's not much out there, it's fine. Every single person does not know whether they've just encountered somebody with the virus, so everyone should behave as if they have. Go to work, that's great, but be careful.
Dana McCauley.
Dana McCauley from the Herald and the Age. Ms Halton, I had a question on the motion for an independent inquiry into the origins of the pandemic at the World Health Assembly. How closely do you think the inquiry should examine the actions of the Chinese authorities at the very beginning of the outbreak in Wuhan? And what do you make of the allegation that the World Health Organization has been overly beholden to China?
Well, to start with, I mean, this is a review, if the resolution passes, that will be constituted with experts and will be undertaken in an orderly fashion. And obviously we would hope, all of us would hope, that the world can benefit from what they discover in terms of the zoonotic event that I've described. I do think it needs to be done carefully and thoughtfully, and I do think that it is in everybody's interest if that actually occurs. And in terms of the timetable, well, do it properly. Don't rush it. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question.
Just about whether the World Health Organization,
Look, the WHO is a creature of its member states. And as I've already indicated, the WHO itself has review mechanisms to consider whether or not the actions that it took are, in retrospect, the right actions to have taken. Now, I've also mentioned, though, that we shouldn't forget that the Chinese government actually released the genetic sequence for this virus on the 9th of January. Now, if you think about it, it takes a while to work out what's going on. Then you've actually got to identify the virus, and then you've actually got to basically make the material available. And they released it on a global not-for-profit platform called GISAID, which is available to every scientist around the world. Now, in terms of WHO's dealings with the Chinese government, I wasn't there. I can't make a comment in terms of their interactions. I do know that they sent a mission to China very early under the leadership of a gentleman called Bruce Aylesford, who is extraordinarily experienced clinician and expert in public health. So I think they were taking steps, but let's see what those reviews ultimately conclude.
Our next question is from Sue Dunleavy.
Sue Dunleavy, News Corp papers, including the Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun. One of the things that mean it could take a very long time to get a vaccine is you have to test if it actually works in preventing the disease. Yes. And traditionally, the safest way of doing that is to inject people in a community where the virus is active and see whether they develop the disease or not. Now, that could take a hell of a long time. There has been some discussion that we should deliberately infect people with COVID-19 who've been vaccinated to see if the vaccination works. Would CEPI be supportive of that approach, because it could put people's health and their lives at risk? And the second question is, does Australia have the capacity to produce a vaccine if some intellectual property becomes available to us to do that? Or do we only have the ability to produce certain types of vaccines at CSL? Could we, for example, produce an mRNA vaccine if that was the one that was the successful candidate?
So to start with, so you're talking about what they call challenge studies. So just for the benefit of people who don't necessarily understand this science, we do various things in terms of testing, phase 1, 2 and 3, but we do preclinical work, and in fact the CSIRO is doing work for CEPI at the moment, doing preclinical work in animal models, and those animal models, and this is chosen, can I just say, globally based on the quality of the science, so that's a big tick for the CSIRO and the facilities in Geelong. And we actually do challenge studies with those animals based on the use of a vaccine. So you're looking basically not only just to safety, but also to see whether in fact you get an effect. So we're actually challenging. It's, in a way, Sue, it's a little hypothetical at the moment. There's lots of virus running around the world, and what you would obviously be looking to do, and phase 1, where we essentially are looking to see whether there's a safe, it's a safe product. And then when you get to phase 2, you're going to start to look at efficacy. Does it work? Now, I think it's far too hypothetical situation to think that we will not have communities around the world where there's enough of this virus running that we cannot find a place to do a phase 2 trial. So this is not something that CEPI has a particular position on, because it's a hypothetical. But what I can say to you is I cannot see a situation where we can't find places where we can do those sorts of trials in the real world.
And the second question was, do we have the capacity to produce all of these vaccines in Australia? So, look, at the end of the day, we have a lot of capacity at the moment with particular kinds of technology, because that's what CSL can do. We haven't yet got to a conversation, and the Australian government might be having that conversation. I mean, we're talking, as CEPI, we're talking with them about the prospect that our homegrown vaccine might be successful, and that they could produce that, and they can produce that if it were to be successful, which is great news. Whether they could produce any of these other multivarious varieties, there is some other vaccine manufacturing capacity in Australia, but we haven't done a detailed analysis of exactly how much they could produce across all those types. We'll get to that point in the fairly near future. What I can tell you is we're looking, and I talked about the multinational companies. Across that full suite of multinational companies, we actually do believe there's capacity to produce nearly all of those vaccines or any of those types. And so we're confident about that. And what we are also looking to do is to make sure that production is globally distributed, because, as I've said, I'm worried about vaccine nationalism. And so global distribution, enough people who can produce, I think should give us the capacity to service the needs of the world. But we're not there yet, Sue. We're working on it. It's a big chart. It's a big negotiation, and we've got a lot of work yet to do. So just on that vaccine nationalism point, you're providing a lot of the money to get the research off the ground to come up with this vaccine. Are you writing into your contracts when you supply this money that the end product of that research, if it's successful, should be provided either free of charge or at least around the world without inhibition, so that everybody can benefit from the money that you've spent?
Yes, so, and recognising that in some cases we provided a lot of money and in some cases we provided a small amount of money. But yes, everyone understands when they take our funding that we have some absolutely unarguable global access provisions. And we are negotiating around exactly those things at the moment. But I would also underscore that the money is not just coming from CEPI. So this is now this race we're getting into, where everyone now is looking to fund, and our challenge is to make sure that we can secure enough supply of the as yet unknown successful vaccine candidate. So as I said, Sue, it's quite tricky. But we are doing those negotiations as we speak. And that mechanism I talked about earlier, the global mechanism, one of its objectives, and Gavi, for those people who don't know, what they do is they procure vaccines for low to middle income countries. And so the conversation we're having with them is about procuring actually for the vulnerable of the world. We're not there yet, but that's what we're working on.
Sarah Ison.
Sarah Ison from the West Australian. Thank you so much for speaking today. You said you'd encourage the government to take action in regards to those vaccine refusers. What could that look like effectively? And how large a concern is a mutation of coronavirus? Is there the concern that a dramatic enough mutation could mean starting from ground zero and regurgitating
tried and true mechanisms in terms of people who are not happy to be vaccinated? We've talked about childcare, we've talked about a series of other things. I think we've seen a couple of pretty prominent cases in the footballing world just at the moment, where, the no jab, no play. So forget the no jab, no play. For kids, it's now no jab, no play for adults. And I would support that. I do think, as I said, that there are some people for a variety of health-related reasons they cannot be vaccinated. Everybody else, as far as I'm concerned, should actually step up and do the right thing.
When you say no jab, no play for adults, do you mean adults in terms of outside of the sporting world?
No. I'm talking about what we've seen to date. I mean, I don't want to speculate about policy responses here. And look, the truth of the matter is, Australians, as a general rule, are good adopters of vaccine. And in fact, the fact that we've currently got a shortage of flu vaccine tells you everything you need to know. So I think Australians will step up when a vaccine's available. We saw this when it was H1N1. People actually stood up to be vaccinated. I think the Minister and I were about the first two, just to demonstrate that we thought this was important. And so I'm not worried about that more broadly, but I think the government will be encouraging people, and I frankly think there'll be a stampede.
And worries about a mutation?
Mutation. So the thing about mutation is this. We know that some viruses mutate quickly, and that causes major a need to shift vaccines pretty significantly, and in some cases they don't. So you would all know that flu vaccines, something you have to go and have every year, because there's different varieties of that flu virus. They mutate pretty regularly. We haven't seen lots and lots of mutation on this virus yet. I'm not saying it won't happen. It's not my area to comment on. It's a particular area of science. But we suspect that if what we see to date is the case, that any vaccine we're producing at the moment based on the genetic material we've got will be pretty good to go.
Our last question, Paul Carr.
Thanks very much for the conversation today. I also wanted to ask about your work at the COVID Commission, and because it seemed when it was first set up that it was dealing with unclogging supply chains and PPE, but increasingly from public comments it also seems to have a role in industry policy and talking about gas as a way to boost jobs and domestic manufacturing on the other side of the crisis. So could I please ask, do you think that the Commission has a role in getting approvals and supporting particular projects, and what your work trying to get vulnerable Australians back into jobs consists of?
So our job in terms of vulnerable Australians, I should say that there is a group of not-for-profit bodies who are working with the Commission precisely because the issue around vulnerable Australians is, I think, so acute. I mean, we're all seeing people standing in lines for Centrelink. We know that there are real challenges for the homeless. That there are a series of people in our community who are normally pretty marginalised and sometimes excluded, and we do not want to get out the other side of this and actually see those people in a worse off position than they now are. And so we need to be as inclusive as we can be in terms of how this recovery goes about. In terms of specifics about projects and gas and all sorts of other things, look, it's too early to make any comment about those things. What I can say to you is the Commission, yes, has done a lot of work on unblocking things, supermarkets, PPE, all of those things, and we will turn our focus to what is actually going to get our economy kick-started. It's really important that we actually have a functioning, growing economy, because at the end of the day, jobs don't appear unless business is out there doing business. And so what we want to be able to see is an increase in productivity in our economy, and we will be working with the government on what some of those ideas might be, but it's early days, so watch this space.